Never take what a woman says as the truth. Women, for survival's sake, learned to manipulate the truth. This has been going on for millennia. You cannot beat them at this game. You cannot fall for their smoke and mirrors and their half-truths that they speak. A woman can never reveal to you her full truth, because her full truth would reveal her flawed nature, her non-feminine behavior, and she knows full well that if she does do that, she's going to break and shatter the fantasy that you have projected onto her.
There's a quiet shift happening right now, and that most people do not want to talk about openly, but everyone can feel it. It is happening in homes, in courts, in online conversations, and in the private decisions men are making when no one is watching. What we are seeing is not a trend or a moment, but a structural change in how men relate to marriage, dating, and society itself. And if you stay with me until the very end of this video, you will understand why this shift is accelerating, why panic is setting in, and why there may be no easy way to reverse it. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. This is how you help this message reach more people who are trying to understand what is happening around them in real time. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly and intelligently. And it is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content flowing. Now let us talk about what is really going on. Across multiple countries, across cultures that are very different from one another, and across economic systems that do not normally move in sync, the same pattern is emerging. Men are walking away. They are walking away from dating. They are walking away from marriage. And in increasing numbers, they are walking away from marriages that already exist. This is not being driven by a single law, a single ideology, or a single online community. It is being driven by lived experience and by a cost-benefit calculation that men are making quietly and rationally. In the United States, divorce filings initiated by men continue to rise. In Australia, the same thing is happening. And now, very notably, it is happening in China at a scale that has forced government attention. That detail alone should make people pause, because China does not usually react publicly unless a trend threatens long-term stability. When men in very different systems all arrive at the same conclusion independently, that tells us something important. At the same time, social media is flooded with videos of women expressing anxiety, frustration, and fear. Many of these videos are about rising costs, about rent, about food prices, and about financial pressure. But layered underneath that is something else. There is a growing number of women openly stating that they cannot find dates, that men no longer approach them, and that the dating market feels empty in a way it never did before. This is not limited to one age group. It spans from young adults into middle age, and it cuts across cities and regions. What makes this moment different is not that relationships are difficult. Relationships have always been difficult. What makes this moment different is that men are no longer trying to fix the difficulty at any cost. In previous generations, men absorbed dissatisfaction, stress, and imbalance because the alternative felt worse. Today, the alternative feels calmer, safer, and more predictable. And that is a profound change. In China, the situation has reached a point where divorce rates and marriage avoidance have triggered legal responses. Laws have been adjusted to reduce financial incentives tied to divorce and to protect assets more clearly. These changes were intended to discourage impulsive separation and stabilize families. But here's the critical point that many analysts miss. Legal pressure does not create emotional commitment. It does not restore trust, and it does not reignite willingness. When a man feels that marriage is primarily a risk management exercise rather than a partnership, his instinct is not to negotiate harder. His instinct is to exit the game entirely. And that is what we are seeing now. Men are not protesting in the streets. They are not organizing mass movements. They are simply opting out quietly, permanently. In China, videos have surfaced of children expressing confusion and sadness over their parents separating. Those moments are heartbreaking and they deserve empathy, but they also reveal something deeper. This is not a trend that can be solved with slogans or campaigns. It is a symptom of long term relational erosion. And once erosion reaches a certain point, pressure only accelerates the collapse. Even in systems where divorce could theoretically be restricted or heavily discouraged, the result would not be restored families. The result would be symbolic marriages and practical abandonment. Men would remain legally married while emotionally and physically absent. They would disengage from family life, relocate, or retreat into isolation. That outcome is worse for everyone involved, including children and society as a whole. A relationship that functions through obligation rather than desire is not stable. It is brittle. It creates resentment rather than loyalty. And men, historically, do not respond well to environments where their effort is expected, but their well being is treated as optional. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the shift is the assumption that men are acting out of anger or spite. In most cases, that is not true. What is driving this is fatigue, emotional fatigue, legal fatigue, social fatigue. Men feel that the rules of engagement changed, that expectations increased, and that accountability became one directional. Over time, that creates withdrawal, not rebellion. For decades, public narratives framed men as problems to be managed rather than partners to be understood. Cultural messaging emphasized what men needed to stop doing, stop wanting, and stop expecting. Meanwhile, the responsibilities men were expected to shoulder remained unchanged or expanded. Work harder, earn more, be present, be supportive, be resilient. Do not complain, do not fail, do not leave. That model only works when men believe the exchange is fair. When they no longer believe that, participation drops. And no government, no campaign, and no law can compel genuine effort from someone who no longer believes in the system they are participating in. A man without a sense of meaning tied to family or society does not become reckless, he becomes selective. He invests his energy where he experiences peace. That might be in work, solitude, hobbies, or self development. But it is no longer automatically directed toward relationships that feel adversarial rather than cooperative. This is where many discussions go off track. Instead of asking why men feel this way, conversations often default to blame. Blame is comforting because it avoids introspection. But blame does not rebuild trust, it does not create attraction, and it does not motivate return. What we are witnessing now is the delayed consequence of decades of messaging that framed into independence without interdependence as empowerment. Independence is valuable, but relationships require mutual reliance. When one side is encouraged to prioritize autonomy above all else, while the other is told to absorb consequences silently, imbalance grows. Men did not wake up one day and decide to disengage. This was a slow accumulation of signals, legal outcomes that felt punitive, social narratives that felt dismissive, relationship dynamics that felt transactional. Over time, men adjusted their behavior to minimize exposure to loss. The simplest way to do that is to not play. The panic emerging now is not about loneliness alone. It is about the sudden realization that participation is voluntary. Men cannot be compelled into desire. They cannot be shamed into attraction. And they cannot be pressured into commitment once trust is gone. This is especially visible in dating. The absence of male initiation is not accidental. It is deliberate risk avoidance. Approaching someone now carries social, emotional, and reputational risk with limited upside. When men assess that equation, many decide it is not worth engaging. Marriage amplifies that calculation. When the perceived downside includes long term financial exposure, loss of autonomy, and legal complexity, while the emotional upside feels uncertain, the rational response is withdrawal. None of this means that healthy relationships no longer exist. They do. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. But they exist where mutual respect, appreciation, and accountability remain intact. What is disappearing is tolerance for imbalance. The uncomfortable truth is that systems built on expectation without reciprocity eventually fail. This is not unique to relationships. It applies to economics, politics, and institutions. When contribution is demanded without regard for sustainability, participation declines. Society is now confronting that reality in real time. And the question is not how to force men back. The question is whether the conditions that drove them away are being acknowledged honestly. This is where the conversation becomes difficult because it requires examining incentives, narratives, and behaviors that have been normalized for years. It requires asking whether the pursuit of individual advantage unintentionally undermined collective stability. And it requires recognizing that desire cannot be regulated. Men walking away is not an act of hostility, it is an act of boundary setting, and boundaries, once established, are not easily reversed through pressure alone. To understand why the shift is accelerating rather than stabilizing, we need to talk about incentives, because human behavior always follows incentives, whether people admit it or not. For a very long time, men were incentivized to commit early, work relentlessly, and sacrifice personal freedom in exchange for stability, respect, and family purpose. That exchange was not perfect, but it was clearly defined. What has changed is not male psychology, but the terms of the agreement. Over time, the perceived rewards of long term commitment eroded while the risks expanded. Legal frameworks became more complex, social expectations became heavier, emotional labor became one directional, and criticism became normalized while appreciation became conditional. That combination creates an environment where effort feels unrewarded and vulnerability feels unsafe. Men are not confused about this, they are adapting to it. One of the most telling signs of this adaptation is how quietly it is happening. There are no mass protests, there are no manifestos, there is just absence. Absence from dating apps, absence from social spaces, absence from marriage proposals, absence from conversations where men once tried to explain themselves. Silence is not apathy. Silence is often the final stage, after repeated attempts to communicate fail. In earlier phases, many men tried to adjust. They tried to be more emotionally expressive. They tried to meet changing expectations. They tried to modernize themselves to fit a shifting cultural model. But adaptation has limits. When the goalposts keep moving and success criteria remain undefined, people stop playing. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail so badly. Shame only works when someone believes the system applying it is legitimate and fair. When legitimacy collapses, shame loses power. At that point, withdrawal becomes the rational response. Another factor that accelerates this trend is visibility. Men now see the outcomes of marriage and divorce in real time. They do not need abstract statistics. They see friends, co-workers, and family members navigating legal disputes, financial loss, and long-term stress. They learn from observation. Humans are pattern recognizing creatures, and the pattern men see is risk heavy and reward uncertain. The digital age has removed plausible deniability. Previous generations entered marriage without a clear understanding of worst case scenarios. Today, worst case scenarios are visible, documented, and searchable. When information asymmetry disappears, behavior changes. This visibility also affects dating expectations. When men see how easily relationships can turn adversarial, they become cautious earlier. Caution looks like disinterest from the outside, but internally, it is self preservation. And self preservation does not reverse itself easily. Meanwhile, many women are experiencing this shift as sudden abandonment. From their perspective, the social environment changed rapidly. Attention decreased, initiative vanished, commitment stalled. That experience creates fear, frustration, and confusion. Those emotions are real and deserve empathy, but they are also downstream effects, not root causes. Fear does not rebuild attraction, pressure does not create desire, and panic does not restore trust. Governments, institutions, and cultural leaders often misunderstand this because they think in terms of compliance rather than consent. Compliance can be enforced, consent cannot. Relationships at their core operate on consent. China's response illustrates this misunderstanding clearly. Adjusting divorce laws may change financial outcomes, but it does not address relational satisfaction. It may delay some separations, but it cannot create willingness where it is absent. When willingness disappears, people find ways to disengage that law cannot prevent. This is not unique to China. Any society that attempts to regulate commitment without addressing incentive balance will encounter the same resistance. People comply just enough to avoid punishment, then disengage emotionally. That outcome erodes trust further and damages long term cohesion. Another overlooked element is how men now conceptualize peace. Peace has become the primary currency. For many men, peace is found in simplicity, predictability, and autonomy. When relationships threaten peace rather than enhance it, they are filtered out. This does not mean men reject companionship, it means they reject volatility. They reject environments where emotional stability feels conditional and effort feels endlessly audited. This also explains why some men still pursue relationships, but only under very specific conditions. Clear boundaries, mutual accountability, low drama, respect for autonomy. These are not extreme demands. They are stability requirements. When those requirements are not met, men opt out rather than attempt to reform. A critical mistake in many discussions is assuming that men need to be convinced to return. Convincing implies persuasion. But persuasion only works when the audience wants what is being offered. If the offer itself is unattractive, better marketing does nothing. What is being offered to men right now often looks like obligation without protection, commitment without security, and responsibility without authority. That is not a compelling value proposition. This creates a paradox. Society needs men to invest. It needs them to work, build, protect, and participate. But it increasingly frames that participation as something owed rather than chosen. When participation is framed as debt, motivation declines. Historically, men invested because investment was linked to identity. Being a husband and father conferred status, meaning, and purpose. When those roles are reframed as liabilities or sources of suspicion, men detach their identity from them. Once identity shifts, behavior follows. You cannot shame someone into identifying with a role they believe harms them. This is why rhetoric that blames men for disengagement backfires. It confirms their perception that they are valued primarily for utility rather than humanity. When someone feels valued only for output, they reduce output to protect themselves. Another layer to this is economic pressure. Inflation, housing costs, and job instability amplify risk aversion. When margins shrink, people become more selective. Men who feel economically squeezed are less willing to assume additional long term obligations with uncertain outcomes. This intersects directly with dating dynamics. Men are not rejecting relationships in a vacuum. They are assessing them within a broader context of cost, stress, and responsibility. When everything feels heavier, unnecessary weight is dropped. The emotional response from many women is understandable. When a system you relied on stops functioning, anxiety is natural. But anxiety alone does not solve structural issues. It often intensifies them. Some responses attempt to reframe the male disengagement as immaturity or fear. That framing misses the point. Fear is not inherently irrational. Fear becomes rational when risk outweighs reward. Dismissing fear without addressing risk does nothing. Others attempt to frame the issue as temporary, suggesting men will return once conditions improve. That assumes men are waiting. Many are not. They have already restructured their lives around absence. Returning would require dismantling a stable peace they have built. Once someone adapts to a quieter, less volatile life, convincing them to re enter turbulence is difficult. The burden of proof shifts heavily. This is why timing matters. Every year, this trend continues. It becomes more entrenched. Younger generations observe older ones and internalize lessons earlier. What begins as a reaction becomes the default. The long term implications of this are profound. Declining marriage rates affect birth rates, social cohesion, and economic stability. Governments can attempt incentives, but incentives that do not address relational trust have limited impact. You cannot subsidize desire. You cannot legislate affection, and you cannot mandate meaning. And meaning is constructed through shared values and mutual respect. When those erode, people withdraw into individual survival strategies. This withdrawal is often mislabeled as a selfishness. But survival is not selfish, it is adaptive. People protect themselves when systems fail to do so. For men, protection increasingly means emotional distance and legal avoidance. That does not make them villains. It makes them cautious participants in an environment they no longer trust. What is especially striking is how little hostility many men express. They are not angry, they are done. Indifference is more dangerous than resentment because it signals finality. You can negotiate with anger, you cannot negotiate with apathy. This indifference terrifies institutions because it removes leverage. You cannot mobilize someone who does not care, and caring cannot be forced. So, where does this leave us? Like, it leaves us at a crossroads. One path involves continuing to apply pressure, assign blame, and attempt to regulate outcomes. That path leads to symbolic compliance and real disengagement. The other path requires honest evaluation of incentive structures and relational norms. That path is uncomfortable, but it is the only one that offers long term stability. Repair, if it is possible, would require restoring balance. Not in slogans, but in lived reality, accountability that runs both directions, respect that is demonstrated, not demanded, security that is tangible, not promised. Men do not need perfection. They need fairness. They need predictability. They need to believe that effort will not be punished and vulnerability will not be exploited. Until those conditions exist, withdrawal will continue quietly, relentlessly. And this is not a phase. This is the new baseline forming in real time. Once a new baseline forms, it does not announce itself loudly, it simply becomes normal. People wake up one day and realize that what once felt temporary has quietly hardened into expectation. This is the stage we are entering now. Men walking away is no longer an exception that raises eyebrows. It is becoming a default assumption that people plan around. You can see this shift in how young men talk about the future. Marriage is no longer framed as a goal, but as a risk. Parenthood is no longer framed as fulfillment, but as exposure. These are not ideas being taught formally. They are conclusions drawn from observation. When enough examples point in the same direction, belief follows. Older generations often struggled to understand this because their lived reality was different. They grew up in an environment where marriage was difficult but stable, where roles were clearer, and where long term effort was rewarded with continuity. Today's environment feels fragmented by comparison, like rules change mid game, expectations expand without clarification, consequences feel asymmetric. That difference matters. One of the most damaging myths is that men disengage because they want less responsibility. In reality, many men are still carrying immense responsibility, but they are choosing where to place it. They are investing in work, in personal health, in skill development, and in financial resilience. What they are avoiding is responsibility that feels legally binding but emotionally unsupported. Responsibility without agency creates resentment. Agency without responsibility creates chaos. Healthy systems balance both. When balance is lost, participation collapses. Another myth is that the shift is driven primarily by online communities. While online spaces reflect and amplify sentiment, they did not create it. They emerged because men were already experiencing the same patterns independently. When people realize their private experiences are shared, articulation follows. Community forms after realization, not before. This distinction matters because it changes how solutions are approached. Silencing discussion does not erase experience. Restricting language does not reverse behavior. When people disengage quietly, they do not need permission or validation to continue doing so. This is why attempts to label male withdrawal as radical or fringe fail. You cannot marginalize a majority behavior by redefining it as extreme. When enough people act similarly, the label loses meaning. When what we are witnessing is not rebellion, it is optimization. Men are optimizing for peace, predictability, and control over outcomes. Optimization does not require ideology, it requires pattern recognition. This is also why many men are not interested in debating these topics publicly anymore. Debate assumes change is possible through persuasion. Many men no longer believe that. They believe change would require structural reform that is unlikely to occur. So they adapt privately instead. Adaptation looks boring from the outside. It looks like opting out of dating apps. It looks like declining invitations. It looks like focusing on routines rather than relationships. It looks like silence, but silence is not absence of thought. It is conclusion. From the perspective of women experiencing this shift, the silence is often interpreted as rejection. That interpretation fuels fear and anger. But fear driven responses tend to escalate conflict rather than resolve it. Some responses attempt to increase pressure on men by framing participation as a moral duty. That framing misunderstands motivation. Moral obligation motivates when people believe the moral system is fair. When they do not, obligation feels coercive. Others attempt to increase incentives through material benefits. But material incentives cannot replace trust. They can supplement it, but they cannot substitute for it. A relationship entered for incentives alone is fragile. Trust is built through consistency and accountability. When accountability is perceived as one directional, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, rebuilding it requires more than policy changes or messaging campaigns. It requires lived behavioral change over time. This is where impatience becomes a problem. Many institutions want quick fixes. They want metrics to improve within election cycles or fiscal quarters. But relational repair operates on human timelines, not bureaucratic ones. It requires sustained effort without guaranteed payoff. Men, observing this impatience, conclude that reform is unlikely. That conclusion reinforces withdrawal. There is also a generational echo effect at play. Younger men observe older men who stayed, sacrificed, and still faced instability. They internalize those lessons early. By the time they reach adulthood, avoidance is already normalized. This early normalization changes everything. When avoidance becomes default, reversal becomes exponentially harder. You are no longer convincing people to return. You are convincing them to abandon a strategy that has worked for them. Strategies that work are rarely abandoned voluntarily. Another aspect often ignored is how male identity has been reshaped. For generations, masculinity was tied to provision and protection. Those roles provided purpose. Today, those same roles are often framed as either unnecessary or suspect. When a role is delegitimized, people detach their identity from it. Once identity detaches, behavior follows. Men no longer measure success by family formation. They measure it by autonomy, stability, and internal satisfaction. This shift is not inherently destructive, but it does have consequences at scale. Societies are built on interdependence. When too many people disengage simultaneously, systems strain. We are beginning to see that strain. Declining birth rates, aging populations, shrinking workforces. Governments respond with incentives, but incentives do not address cultural trust. They address surface behavior. The underlying issue remains unresolved. One of the most uncomfortable truths in this conversation is that many men feel their goodwill was exploited. They feel they were encouraged to be open, supportive, and accommodating, only to find that openness increased vulnerability rather than connection. When vulnerability becomes a liability, people close themselves off. Closing off is protective, not malicious. But protection reduces intimacy, and intimacy is the foundation of family formation. This creates a feedback loop. Reduced intimacy leads to fewer relationships. Fewer relationships lead to less shared understanding. Less understanding leads to more suspicion. More suspicion leads to more withdrawal. Breaking that loop requires trust signals that are credible, not verbal assurances, but behavioral consistency. This is where many proposed solutions fail. They focus on rhetoric rather than reality. They promise understanding without demonstrating it. They demand participation without offering security. Men respond to demonstrated change, not promises. Promises have been overused. It is also important to recognize that not all men experience this equally. Men with resources have more options. Men without resources face higher stakes. For the latter group, risk avoidance becomes even more pronounced. A single adverse outcome can be catastrophic. This disparity creates another layer of withdrawal. Men who feel they cannot afford mistakes avoid situations where mistakes are likely. Relationships under current conditions feel unpredictable. Predictability is undervalued in modern discourse, but it is essential for commitment. People commit when they can reasonably anticipate outcomes. When outcomes feel arbitrary, commitment declines. Another dimension to this is legal opacity. Many men do not fully understand the legal implications of marriage until they experience them secondhand. Once they do, clarity replaces optimism. Clarity without reassurance leads to caution. Transparency alone does not solve this. Transparency without reform simply accelerates avoidance. The result is a growing population of men who are functionally invisible in relationship statistics. They are not dating. They are not marrying. They are not divorcing. They exist outside the system entirely. Systems struggle to respond to invisibility. You cannot regulate what you cannot see. You cannot incentivize what does not engage. This invisibility is often misinterpreted as disengagement from society as a whole, but many of these men are still productive, law abiding, and self sufficient. They simply opt out of relational structures they perceive as hostile. That distinction matters. This is not collapse through chaos. It is fragmentation through choice. And fragmentation is harder to reverse because it does not trigger immediate crisis. It unfolds gradually. By the time consequences become undeniable, patterns are entrenched. We are approaching that stage now. Public discourse is beginning to acknowledge male withdrawal, but often in a reactive way. The tone is urgent, sometimes accusatory, sometimes pleading. Neither approach works. Urgency without understanding breeds resistance. Understanding requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some assumptions may have been wrong, that some policies may have had unintended consequences, that some narratives may have oversimplified complex dynamics. Humility is difficult in polarized environments, but without it, reconciliation is impossible. Men are not asking to be placed above others. They are asking not to be treated as expendable. They are asking for symmetry in expectations and consequences. Symmetry builds trust. Asymmetry destroys it. Until symmetry is restored in meaningful ways, the trend will continue. Not because men want it to, but because adaptation favors survival. And survival, when it becomes habitual, becomes identity. This is why the window for change is narrower than many realize. Each year that passes normalizes disengagement further. Each cohort that grows up observing it internalizes it earlier. At some point, society will not be asking why men left. It will be asking how to function without them in roles they once filled willingly. That is not a future anyone openly desires. But futures do not require desire to arrive. They require momentum. Momentum is already here. When men withdraw at scale, the consequences do not remain abstract. They do not stay confined to dating apps or online conversations. They move into daily life, economics, family structures, and long term security. And while this shift affects society as a whole, it carries specific and tangible consequences for women that are already beginning to surface. The first consequence is scarcity of commitment. Attention is not commitment, and those two have been confused for a long time. In earlier phases, attention was abundant even if commitment was uneven. Now, attention itself is thinning and commitment has become rare. When fewer men pursue relationships seriously, the pool of available partners shrinks, not gradually, but sharply. This creates a competitive environment that many women were not prepared for. Because for decades, the cultural narrative emphasized abundance rather than scarcity. Scarcity changes behavior. It raises anxiety. It increases comparison. It shifts expectations downward. Sometimes abruptly, women who assumed they could delay long term decisions without consequence are now confronting a market that has moved on without them. This does not mean they did anything wrong individually. It means the environment changed faster than social expectations adjusted. The second consequence is financial vulnerability. For many women, partnership functioned as a stabilizing force even when independence was emphasized rhetorically. Dual income households, shared housing costs, and cooperative long term planning buffered economic shocks. As partnership rates decline, more women face rising costs alone. Inflation does not negotiate. Rent does not care about ideology. Bills arrive whether or not the social narrative prepared people for solo sustainability. This is especially pronounced in urban environments where housing costs were implicitly designed around shared expenses. When those shared structures disappear, the burden concentrates. Women who expected partnership to eventually offset costs are now facing long term financial planning alone, often later than ideal. The third consequence is delayed or foregone family formation. Biology does not respond to social trends. Timelines matter whether or not they are popular to discuss. As commitment opportunities shrink, choices narrow. Some women will choose to remain child free, others will face difficult trade offs under time pressure. Neither path is inherently wrong, but both carry emotional weight that is often minimized in public discourse. What makes this more difficult is the lack of honest conversation. Many women were told they could have everything on their own timeline without cost. That message was incomplete. Choice always carries trade offs. When trade offs are not discussed, people feel blindsided rather than informed. Another consequence is emotional isolation. Romantic relationships often served as emotional anchors, even when imperfect. As those anchors disappear, loneliness increases. Social networks can compensate to a degree, but they do not fully replace intimate partnership for many people. The result is a quiet increase in emotional strain that does not show up in curated online content. This strain is visible in the growing number of women expressing exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty online. These expressions are not performative, they are signals of adaptation stress. When systems people relied on stop functioning, distress is a rational response. And the next consequence is reduced leverage in negotiation. In an environment of abundance, individuals can afford strict criteria. In an environment of scarcity, criteria are reassessed. This reassessment is already happening. Women who once expected high levels of investment up front are encountering men who no longer compete for access. That shift changes dynamics fundamentally. Negotiation requires mutual desire. When one side disengages, negotiation power evaporates. This leads to frustration on both sides, but especially for those who expected leverage to remain constant. Another consequence is increased responsibility without support. As partnership declines, more women shoulder full responsibility for housing, finances, and long term planning alone. Independence is empowering when chosen intentionally and supported structurally. It is burdensome when it becomes the default without preparation. This distinction matters. Many women embraced independence ideologically while still assuming partnership would exist practically. When that assumption fails, independence feels less like freedom and more like obligation. There is also a social consequence that is rarely discussed openly. As men withdraw, social spaces become less balanced. Mixed gender environments thin out. Social activities fragment. This reduces organic interaction and further accelerates isolation. When people do not meet naturally, trust erodes faster. This fragmentation also affects safety nets. Informal support systems weaken when fewer households form. Extended family structures shrink. Community cohesion declines. These changes disproportionately affect those who expected relational networks to expand over time. Another long term consequence is aging without partnership. This is not about fear mongering, it is about planning. Aging is easier with cooperative support. Health events, mobility issues, and caregiving become more complex alone. Women historically relied on family structures to navigate later life. As those structures decline, institutional dependence increases. Institutions, however, are not designed to replace emotional bonds. They manage logistics, not meaning. This gap becomes more visible with time. The emotional impact of this realization is significant. Many women are now confronting a future that looks different from what they were told to expect. That discrepancy creates grief. Grief does not always look like sadness. It often looks like anger, denial, or bargaining. Some responses attempt to pressure men back through moral framing. Others attempt to dismiss male withdrawal as temporary or immature. These responses are understandable, but they do not address the underlying issue. Pressure without incentive accelerates disengagement. There is also a reputational consequence. As men disengage, the dating environment changes tone. Suspicion increases, trust decreases, interactions become more guarded. This environment punishes sincerity and rewards detachment. Women seeking genuine connection find fewer opportunities to express it safely. This shift also impacts how women are perceived, unfairly but realistically. In a scarce environment, people rely on heuristics. Age, history, and expectations are assessed more critically. This is not moral judgment, it is market behavior. Markets do not care about fairness, they respond to supply and demand. And ignoring this reality does not protect people from it, preparation does. Another consequence is internal conflict. Many women now feel torn between beliefs they were taught and outcomes they are experiencing. This cognitive dissonance creates stress. Resolving it requires reevaluation of assumptions, which is emotionally difficult. Some will choose to double down on ideology, others will quietly adjust expectations. Quiet adjustment is more common because public admission carries social risk. This silent recalibration mirrors male withdrawal. Both sides are adapting privately rather than resolving issues collectively. That mutual silence deepens distance. There is also a generational ripple effect. Younger women observe older women navigating these challenges and internalize lessons earlier. This may lead to earlier attempts at partnership for some and complete disengagement for others. Polarization increases. The long term effect is stratification. A smaller number of stable partnerships surrounded by a larger number of individuals navigating life alone. This structure is less resilient to shocks. Economic downturns, health crises, and social instability hit harder when cooperative units are fewer. Another consequence is the rise of transactional alternatives. When organic relationships decline, substitutes emerge. These substitutes provide short term relief, but do not replicate long term stability. Over time, dissatisfaction grows. Women entering these arrangements often do so pragmatically, not idealistically. Pragmatism is rational, but it can be emotionally draining when it replaces genuine connection. The most difficult consequence to acknowledge is loss of choice. Choice shrinks when options shrink. Many women believed choice would expand indefinitely. That belief was shaped by a unique historical moment of abundance. That moment is ending. This does not mean women are powerless. It means strategy matters again. Timing matters again. Trade offs matter again. Ignoring that reality increases pain. The final consequence is societal tension. When large groups feel disappointed, insecure, or misled, frustration seeks an outlet. That outlet can be productive or destructive. Productive responses involve honest reassessment and adaptation. Destructive responses involve blame and coercion. The direction society takes will shape outcomes for decades. None of this means women deserve hardship. It means systems changed without preparing people for consequences. Acknowledging consequences is not cruelty, it is responsibility. Understanding these outcomes is the first step toward meaningful adjustment. Denial delays adaptation. Blame accelerates division. Honesty creates possibility. As withdrawal becomes normalized, something else emerges alongside it that is rarely discussed openly: freedom. Not the abstract kind, often marketed in slogans, but practical, lived freedom that reshapes daily life. For many men, stepping away from dating, marriage, and long term relational obligation has unlocked a level of autonomy they did not realize they had been missing until it returned. This freedom does not arrive as celebration, it arrives quietly. It shows up as reduced stress, clear thinking, and a sense of control over time and energy. Men begin to notice that decisions no longer require constant negotiation or emotional risk assessment. Plans can be made and executed without anticipating conflict. Peace becomes predictable rather than conditional. One of the most immediate freedoms men experience is psychological bandwidth. When relational volatility disappears, mental load decreases. There is less second guessing, fewer unspoken rules to navigate, and less fear of misinterpretation. This clarity improves focus across all areas of life. Work becomes more productive. Health routines become more consistent. Sleep improves. These are not dramatic transformations, they are cumulative gains that compound over time. Another freedom is financial autonomy. Without the expectation of provisioning for a partner or family under uncertain conditions, men gain greater control over their resources. Spending becomes intentional rather than compensatory. Saving and investing decisions are aligned with personal goals rather than relational expectations. Risk can be managed strategically instead of reactively. This financial clarity often leads to long term resilience. Men build buffers, they reduce debt, they plan for contingencies. Without the pressure to perform financially for relational validation, money becomes a tool rather than a measuring stick. That shift reduces anxiety and increases confidence. Time freedom is another major change. Relationships require scheduling, compromise, and constant presence. When men opt out, time becomes theirs again. Evenings are no longer negotiated, weekends are flexible, travel can be spontaneous. This freedom allows men to reconnect with interests they abandoned or never explored. Many men rediscover creativity during this phase. They write, build, learn, and experiment. Projects that once felt impractical become viable. Skill development accelerates. This is not escapism. It is re engagement with self directed purpose. Social freedom also changes. Men choose relationships more selectively. Friendships deepen rather than multiply. Social interactions become lower drama and higher trust. Men no longer feel obligated to maintain appearances or perform emotional labor in environments that do not reciprocate. This selectivity improves quality of life. Fewer relationships does not mean less connection. It often means better connection. Men invest where appreciation is evident and withdraw where it is not. Another form of freedom is emotional sovereignty. Men are no longer required to constantly justify boundaries or explain discomfort. Emotional expression becomes optional rather than mandatory. This does not mean emotional suppression, it means emotional choice. Men decide when and how to engage rather than being expected to perform vulnerability on demand. This sovereignty reduces resentment. When emotions are shared voluntarily, they strengthen connection. When they are extracted under pressure, they weaken it. Men stepping away from extraction experience relief. There is also freedom from reputational risk. Modern dating and relationships carry social exposure. Misunderstandings can escalate quickly. Withdrawal reduces that exposure dramatically. Men feel safer expressing opinions, setting boundaries, and living privately without fear of public consequences. This safety encourages authenticity. Men no longer need to curate behavior for approval. They can align actions with values without constant self monitoring. Physical freedom follows as well. Health becomes a personal priority rather than a shared negotiation. Men train, rest, and recover according to their own rhythms. Diet, exercise, and routines stabilize. This stability improves longevity and vitality. Over time, men notice that their lives feel quieter but fuller, not filled with noise but with intention. This quiet fullness contrasts sharply with the chaos many experienced in relational environments that felt unpredictable. Freedom also changes how men view compromise. Compromise is no longer automatic, it becomes earned. Men are willing to compromise when mutual benefit is clear. They are unwilling when compromise feels one sided. This recalibration protects energy and reinforces self respect. Self respect is a recurring theme in this phase. When men stop participating in systems that erode it, they rebuild it internally. Confidence increases not through dominance, but through alignment. Life feels coherent rather than conflicted. Another important freedom is future orientation. Men can plan without fear of sudden disruption. Goals can be long term. Career moves can be strategic. Relocation becomes an option. Life becomes modular rather than fixed. This modularity is empowering. Men can adapt without unraveling entire life structures. Flexibility replaces fragility. Some men channel this freedom into mentorship, entrepreneurship, or community building. Without the weight of relational instability, they have surplus energy. That energy finds constructive outlets. Productivity rises. This creates a paradox. Men who disengage from traditional relationships often become more stable, more productive, and more content. That outcome challenges assumptions that relationships are the primary source of male fulfillment. Fulfillment turns out to be multifaceted. This does not mean men reject companionship entirely. It means companionship is no longer central by default. It must earn its place. That shift changes the entire relational landscape. Another subtle freedom is freedom from expectation. Men are no longer expected to perform certain roles simply because of their gender. They define roles for themselves. This self definition strengthens identity. Identity clarity reduces internal conflict. When expectations align with values, stress decreases. Men feel less divided. Freedom also alters how men perceive risk. With fewer relational stakes, men take calculated risks in business, learning, and exploration. These risks often yield growth. Growth reinforces confidence. Confidence reinforces autonomy. There is also freedom in solitude. Solitude is no longer a failure state, it is a chosen environment. Men learn to enjoy their own company. This self sufficiency reduces desperation and improves emotional regulation. Solitude strengthens discernment. Men become better judges of character because they are not rushing to fill gaps. Patience replaces urgency. As this freedom becomes normalized, men stop seeking validation externally. Approval loses importance. Internal metrics replace social ones. This internal orientation stabilizes mood and reduces reactivity. Reduced reactivity improves communication. When men do engage, they do so calmly and clearly. Boundaries are stated without aggression. Disengagement is clean rather than dramatic. This calm disengagement is often misinterpreted as coldness. It is not. It is emotional efficiency. Another freedom is freedom from escalation. Conflicts no longer spiral because men exit rather than argue. This exit option is powerful. It discourages manipulation and rewards mutual respect. Over time, men internalize that peace is non negotiable. Once peace becomes the baseline, anything that threatens it is evaluated critically. This evaluation protects well being. This new baseline also influences how men approach any future relationships. Standards rise, not in terms of perfection, but in terms of stability. Men seek calm, cooperation, and accountability. Anything else feels unnecessary. Freedom also reframes masculinity. Strength is no longer measured by endurance of discomfort, it is measured by ability to choose wisely. Walking away becomes a sign of discernment rather than weakness. When this reframing spreads socially, younger men observe older men living calmly and intentionally. They internalize those lessons early. Freedom becomes aspirational. As more men experience these benefits, return becomes less appealing. Why re enter volatility when peace is available? This question lingers beneath every decision. The cumulative effect is a cultural shift. Men are no longer oriented around being needed, they are oriented around being fulfilled. Fulfillment is quieter but more sustainable. This does not mean society collapses immediately, it means society changes shape. Roles redistribute, expectations adjust. Some systems strain, others adapt. The key point is that freedom, once experienced, is rarely surrendered voluntarily. Men who have rebuilt their lives around autonomy are unlikely to return to structures that previously drained them without significant change. This is why future negotiation, if it occurs, will look different. It will not be driven by obligation or guilt, it will be driven by mutual benefit and respect. Freedom raises the bar. And once the bar is raised, it does not easily lower. This is the reality forming now. Quiet, unannounced, relentless, and it is reshaping the social landscape in ways that will define the next generation. As we reach the end of this discussion, it becomes necessary to talk about trajectories rather than moments. Short term discomfort can be endured, long term structural imbalance cannot. What matters now is not how people feel today, but what becomes normal tomorrow if nothing changes quickly. If current patterns continue without meaningful adjustment, hard times will increasingly define daily life for many women, while men who have already adapted will settle into simpler, more stable, and more comfortable lives. This was not a moral claim. It is an economic and behavioral observation rooted in how people allocate resources under pressure. The core issue is cost of living relative to dependency. The average man requires relatively little to maintain a satisfactory standard of living. This is not a judgment, it is a function of preferences, consumption patterns, and social expectations. Men tend to be more tolerant of minimalism. Smaller living spaces, fewer discretionary expenses, simpler routines, and lower social spending do not feel like deprivation to many men. They feel like efficiency. This tolerance for simplicity becomes a strategic advantage when partnership declines. Men adjust downward easily. They reduce expenses, streamline life, and remove friction. A modest apartment, reliable food, basic transportation, and digital connectivity are often sufficient. Comfort comes from peace, autonomy, and predictability rather than accumulation. Women, on average, face a different reality. This is not because of excess or irresponsibility, but because social, biological, and structural factors create higher baseline costs. Housing expectations are higher. Safety considerations matter more. Health expenses differ. Social participation carries different pressures. The margin for radical minimalism is smaller. When partnership existed as an assumed future state, these differences were buffered. Shared housing costs, pooled income, cooperative planning, and mutual support reduced individual burden. As partnership declines, those buffers disappear. This is where the single life penalty becomes unavoidable. The singles tax is not a slogan, it is a structural reality. Rent does not halve because you live alone. Utilities do not scale proportionally. Insurance costs do not drop. Food packaging and pricing often penalize single consumers. Time costs rise. Every task requires individual effort. When two incomes become one, costs do not divide evenly, they concentrate. Men absorb this concentration more easily because they simplify aggressively. Women, facing higher baseline expectations and constraints, feel the squeeze sooner and harder. This is already visible in housing insecurity, delayed savings, and increased financial stress among single women. Inflation magnifies this disparity. As prices rise, flexibility matters. Those who can cut discretionary spending without significant quality of life loss adapt. Those whose expenses are less elastic struggle. Men who have opted out early already made these adjustments. They downsized, they simplified, they built routines around low overhead. As costs rise, they feel inconvenience rather than crisis. Women entering long term singlehood later face adjustment shock. Habits formed under different assumptions collide with new constraints. The gap between expectation and reality creates stress. This is not about blame, it is about timing. Another factor is emotional economy. Men who disengaged learned to self regulate emotionally without relational reinforcement. They rely less on external validation. This reduces spending associated with social signaling and emotional coping. Fewer status purchases, fewer compensatory expenses, less pressure to perform lifestyle success publicly. Women socialize differently, often experience greater pressure to maintain appearance, social presence, and relational readiness even when single. These pressures carry financial cost. When income does not increase to match, stress rises. Health and aging amplify these trends. Preventative care, safety, and long term planning require resources. Without partnership, these costs fall entirely on the individual. Men relying on simpler lifestyles and lower expectations adapt more easily. Women face higher stakes if preparation is delayed. Over time, these pressures compound. Year after year, the gap widens between those who optimized early and those forced to adjust late. Compounding does not announce itself, it accumulates quietly. This is why urgency matters now. Structural change delayed becomes structural hardship normalized. Meanwhile, men who exited relational volatility experience a different trajectory. Their lives stabilize, they build savings, they invest cautiously, they reduce exposure to legal and emotional risk. Their needs remain modest. Luxury for them is not excess, it is absence of stress. Luxury becomes waking up without conflict. It becomes spending money without anxiety. It becomes time ownership. It becomes quiet. This quiet comfort does not require high income. It requires low overhead and autonomy. Many men achieve it with average earnings once relational obligations are removed. This reality creates an asymmetry that grows with time. Men living simply feel increasingly secure. Women carrying higher costs alone feel increasingly strained. At that point, appeals to return lose power. Why would someone leave stability for instability? Why would someone abandon peace for pressure? Change, if it is to occur, must occur before this equilibrium solidifies. Because once equilibrium sets in, behavior locks. People build lives around it. They relocate. They plan retirement accordingly. They adapt identities. Reversal becomes improbable. For women, the risk is not immediate collapse, it is gradual narrowing, narrower options, narrower margins, narrower futures. This narrowing produces difficult choices: work longer, lower standards, accept arrangements previously avoided, or embrace solitude under strain. None of these are easy paths. For men, the path ahead remains comparatively smooth unless disrupted. Their simplicity insulates them, their autonomy protects them, their expectations align with reality. This divergence is not destiny, it is trajectory. Trajectories can change, but only through deliberate action. What would change require? It would require restoring mutual incentive, not symbolic gestures, but realignment of cost and benefit. It would require reducing asymmetry in risk. It would require cultural narratives that value cooperation rather than extraction. It would require accountability that runs both directions. And most importantly, it would require speed. Delay favors the adapted, delay entrenches patterns, delay turns preference into identity. If adjustment does not happen soon, the outcome will not be dramatic collapse. It will be quiet endurance on one side and quiet struggle on the other. Hard times rarely arrive with alarms, they arrive as normalization of strain. The question is not whether anyone deserves hardship. The question is whether systems adapt before hardship becomes permanent. This conversation is not about fear, it is about foresight. Ignoring economic realities does not make them kinder. Confronting them early offers the only chance to soften outcomes. Men have already adapted, women are adapting now. Whether adaptation leads to balance or divergence depends on choices made quickly. History shows that once populations settle into survival strategies that work, they do not abandon them easily. Peace, once found, is guarded fiercely. That is the reality facing us. And it is why this moment matters more than people realize. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed today? Do you agree with the analysis? Where do you see this going? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.